Okay, so we're good to get started. Good morning, afternoon, and evening for those of us joining us from around the world today. Welcome to another Kemp Expert Series webinar on addressing the top 3 challenges of modern application delivery. We are delighted to have MVP Richard Hicks with us today, who will be joined by James Basso, Solutions Architect at Kemp, to deliver today's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. Today's recording will be made available on demand after today's webinar, and that will be communicated out in a follow-up email. After the presentation, we will set aside some time for Q&A, so please pop any questions you may have into the Q&A box on your screen. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see a number of resources, which includes a link to a Chem360 customer success story with ASOS, one of the world's leading online fashion sites, plus a solution brief on our Cloud Mila consumption model. Finally, we've included a short survey on today's webinar on your own cloud journey. We would appreciate if you could complete the survey, which will allow us to better understand you, our customers. We're excited to have you all with us today, and I hope that you find this presentation valuable. Over to you, Richard.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it very much. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Andrew said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I see we have folks from around the world. That's always fun when we got a lot of different folks on the call today. My name is Richard Hicks. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction. For those of you who don't know me, let me do just a very brief introduction here. My name is Richard Hicks. I am the founder and principal consultant of Richard M. Hicks Consulting. I came up with that name by myself, by the way. I'm pretty clever, huh? Anyway, I am a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, or MVP. I have been for the last 8 years, most recently awarded in the cloud and data center and enterprise security expertise areas. So I have a deep understanding and experience with Microsoft security and networking solutions. Been in the business for many years now. I've actually been in the IT field as my second career for more than 20 years. So I have a lot of experience in very large scale corporate computing environments. I used to work for a Fortune 100 financial services institution based here in the United States. You can visit my website at directaccess.richardhicks.com. My favorite social media platform is the Twitters. You can find me on Twitter at Richard Hicks. If you follow Kemp, any of the Kemp Twitter feeds, they commonly are tweeting the capabilities and features that I document and author and so forth on their platforms and their solutions. So a little bit about today's webinar. This is going to be a little different than probably most of the webinars that you've attended, at least recently. This is not going to be death by PowerPoint. This is not going to be me just running through PowerPoint slides and doing slide karaoke and all of that sort of stuff. This is going to be a very dynamic, very interactive session. I have with me today James Basso, who is a solution architect for Kemp, and he's going to demonstrate a lot of the capabilities of the Chem360 Central platform. And we're basically just going to have a conversation. We're going to answer your questions. By the way, when you have questions, pop them up immediately, because we'll actually be taking them as we go. So if you have questions about capabilities and features and things that we're demonstrating, go ahead and throw those in there, and we'll try to answer them as quickly as possible. Don't bother waiting to the end. We'll try to get to those soon. The Kemp platform that we're talking about today is the Chem360 Central. And Chem360 Central is a centralized management solution that's used to manage application delivery controllers or load balancers in your organization. The idea here with Chem360 Central is that it could manage obviously more than one. If you have multiple or distributed application delivery controllers or load balancers in your environment, Chem360 Central can monitor and provide visibility into all of them. So if you have 2, if you have 20, if you have 2,000, it doesn't care. We're going to be able to manage them centrally from one location. And James is going to demonstrate some of those things for us. The beauty of this solution is that it is not a Kemp exclusive solution. So one of the things that you'll see is that it does work with third-party load balancers. So that's pretty impressive. And it does a number of different things. We'll talk about those. But what we want to focus on in this webinar is kind of the top 3 challenges that we face as ADC or load balancer administrators. So the first one that I want to talk about is simply ADC management. Again, you might have 1 or 2 load balancers in your environment, and that's awesome. But if you have 5 or 10 or 100 or 1,000, then you really understand the pain that managing and monitoring and maintaining, basically managing all of these application delivery controllers in your environment. By the way, that challenge gets even more difficult and more exacerbated when you have load balancers just in multiple physical locations, but also you may have some running in the cloud. So you may have a bunch of load masters, physical and virtual appliances in different data centers on premises in your environment, but you might also have some VLMs running in Azure or AWS. Another challenge that I want to talk about and really touch on is visibility. Now, with visibility, of course, we're not just talking about up-down basic status, because honestly, we can get alerts on that, right? So if we have a real server's down, we can get alerts. We can float that up through syslog and our management consoles and bubble that up. What the Chem360 Central solution does, and one of the things that I find extremely powerful on that, is it gives you a lot of very intuitive, very easy to use charts and graphs, kind of things that give you an idea of how the solution is running. And again, not just up, down, but where in the spectrum of utilization are we? Is it high, medium, low? Those types of things. Where is it compared to the thresholds that I know? I have an understanding of the baseline of my environment and my particular applications. How do I know if I'm above or below that? Not just simply up, down, but again, how is it performing? There are some scenarios in which, and James and I will demonstrate those later, in which it might be really important to know when resources are underutilized, and that comes into licensing. Now, licensing, of course, is the last one of the top 3 challenges that we're going to talk about in today's webinar, and that has so licensing has been traditionally fairly straightforward for appliances like this, because you bought the appliance, physical or virtual, you paid for the license, you bought the support, and you were good to go. But the cloud kind of blurs those lines a bit and really makes the traditional ADC licensing model really difficult. In terms of cloud consumption, of course, one of the things with the cloud, and one of the selling points with the cloud, is this near limitless capacity. You know, we always hear this when we go to the talks from Amazon and from Microsoft. Hey, you know, get your stuff to the cloud. You can do all of these things to make it completely elastic, right? Elastic seems to be one of those keywords. You know, we can implement a solution, or we can implement a platform or an application in the cloud, and if we need additional capacity, we can scale that up and just, you know, provision more virtual machines and everything, and it just sounds really, really awesome. And in fact, it is. But that assumption is based on the fact that you are using the native load balancing capabilities of those clouds, the Elastic Load Balancer in AWS, or, you know, the Azure Load Balancer. The challenge with that is that many of our applications, we want to use advanced application delivery controller capabilities, such as those provided by the Kemp Virtual Load Master, and we want to run those in the cloud as well. So how do we license those? So if I need to spin up 5 load balancers, but I also have some high demand where I need to spin up another 5 more, do I need to purchase 5 additional licenses and contract supports and things like that? Because it may only need this for a few hours or a few days or weeks or months or something like that. The Kemp has a fantastic new cloud licensing model that I think is really compelling. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but fundamentally it's called metered licensing, or MILA. It's a new licensing agreement from Kemp that allows you to spin up as many load masters as you want. They don't care if you have 2 or 2,000. All they care about is the peak throughput, and that's all you pay for. So in that capability, or in that scenario, we have the ability to implement the load master. And this is, by the way, how this ties into Chem360 Central, is that all of the cloud metered licensing is enabled and supported by the Chem360 Central. So we can deploy all these load balancers, we can scale up and scale down as we want, and at the end of the month they look at the throughput or the peak throughput, and then you are billed according to that. We'll talk a lot more detail about that as we go, but I want to make sure that everybody's aware that there are some really compelling cloud licensing and consumption models that are something you're probably going to want to very seriously look at as well. And by the way, there is actually a video that's a part of the presentation, should be on the resources tab there, where Kemp had done some work with the folks at ASOS out in the UK. ASOS is kind of an UK Amazon or AWS, right? Or excuse me, Amazon, the retail selling arm of Amazon. There's a great video there that talks about how ASOS met demand using Chem360 Central and Azure to effectively scale and handle some of their busiest days ever, and how they did it without disruption and without any downtime. So it's pretty impressive. Take a look at that for sure. Anyway, let me get on to the meat of the presentation, which is taking a look at the Chem360 Central console. So again, as I mentioned, we have James Basso on the line. James, if you could share your desktop and give us a look at the Chem360 Central, and we'll walk through a couple of scenarios that I think will be important to our viewers. And the first one, James, I want to touch on is just simple ADC management.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the introduction, Richard. As mentioned, as a solution architect at Kemp Technologies, we do face a lot of the issues that you just had mentioned and summarized. And as companies move to the cloud, whether it's wholeheartedly or in some kind of hybrid design, they are looking for companies with flexibility to meet those challenges. And Kemp is doing a great job with that. So today what we're going to look at is Chem360 Central. And as mentioned, you will be able to manage and monitor your load masters in addition to other ADC devices. Okay, now the purpose from a Chem perspective is to really give you flexibility in situations where you may have a lot of different ADCs, or the situation where maybe those ADCs are spreading across multiple data centers and regions. Now, when we take a look at the Chem360 Central homepage, it's very clear you can get a good idea of what's going on in your environment at just a glance. By navigating over to this cloud icon on the left side of the screen, I'm just going to circle it on the screen here for you. You can see what we've done is we've set up several different networks. Now, if you take a look at the labels we have load masters in all different areas of the world, in Azure and AWS, in some co-locations, and some hosted privately that are available via VPN. Now, the Chem360 Central is going to give you visibility into how each of these devices are working. So even if you just needed to see if the device was operational or up, you could simply expand these sections and then take a look at the load masters that you've configured. Okay, and this will give you some insight as to exactly how the load masters look at a glance. So no matter how many load masters you have, we can basically condense the view of all those devices into a single pane that we call Chem360 Central. So in essence, it's one place to see it all at a high level. And then if you wanted to, you could also go into a deeper dive and actually modify the services just as you were natively working with the device.
So that brings up an excellent question, James. When we talk about management, in other words, we don't want to simply be able to just see everything from Chem360 Central and then ultimately have to go to a device to do some sort of configuration or maintenance. So with Chem360 Central, we have the ability not only to make configuration changes, in other words, spin up a new virtual server, add some real servers to the service and those types of things. But we have the ability to do things like configuration maintenance, or not configuration maintenance, I'm talking about platform maintenance, right? So in other words, if I need to bring these load masters up to a new update level, so I can do all of that as well with Chem360 Central, correct?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So what you'll find is Chem360 Central can act as a repository for a lot of things, including firmware. So because you have the ability to interact with all the different load masters in your various environments, one thing our end users are doing is using it to push firmware to their devices. Normally with the load masters, you would log into the web user interface and do this manually, or maybe run an API-based script to complete the functionality. But within the Chem360 Central platform, you actually have the ability to schedule firmware updates. So you would want to download the firmware from the Loadmasters homepage here under the Support tab. Once you do that, it's just a matter of importing it to your firmware repository. And as you see, there's a few patches we have here. Oh, let's see, the screen's taking a little bit. Let me just let you update. So effectively, we can update the firmware from the Chem360 device either instantaneously, or we can schedule that. And that's as simple as going to the individual node that you'd like to modify. So as I go back to my network scheme and click on CS-LMO1, it will now allow me within the system configuration on the right-hand side to then select my update Loadmaster firmware. Okay. And from here, it's pretty easy to, of course, schedule whatever you'd like to apply.
Well, that was going to be my next question for you, James. Do you have the ability to schedule this, right? In other words, when you push this out, it doesn't happen to all 2,000 of your load masters or something, and they all reboot at the same time, right?
Well, I mean, if that's the goal, we can certainly accomplish that. But I think tiering the failover and the application of firmware is probably what most people would go for. So the nice thing is,
no question.
Once these load masters do reboot, of course, you're able to monitor the logs from here as well and ensure everything is up and running as it's intended.
Outstanding. And that's tremendously helpful. And I think that's one of the things that especially administrators with very large deployments have to struggle with is getting all of their solutions or getting all their ADCs on the same firmware, right? Because there are updates to firmware not only for features but for performance, but importantly security as well. And oftentimes the load master is public facing, so we want to ensure that those things are up to date and kept up to date reasonably in a reasonable fashion. So this is obviously a very powerful tool that helps users do that. Now, with regards to reboots, I see we have a system reboot. If we need to just simply reboot appliances, obviously we can do that here from a centralized location. One of the things that I also wanted to talk about, you'd mentioned logs. So the Chem360 Central does consume syslog, correct?
That's correct, and that's primarily how the logging is updated at the Loadmaster Chem360 Central level. If we click on the global repository here, you can basically see that we've made it very easy for our end users to inspect their logs. Essentially, if there's a specific phrase or keyword they're looking for, or even severity level, you can look through the different logs in each Loadmaster looking for potential issues. And we made it very easy to pinpoint exactly those logs that you are looking for.
Outstanding. And this is a feature that I really like, and it's kind of a sleeper capability, but it's one that I really like because in many environments, you have a central logging solution, right? So you have a SIM of some sort, right? Could be Splunk, could be anything, right? Doesn't matter. But that's where everything goes. And as an ADC administrator, it has always been challenging because it's like, I'm in the manager console, I want to look at the syslogs, but now I have to jump out to another tool. Here, one of the things I like about this is that that all of the syslogs from just my ADCs, not all the routers and switches and firewalls and proxies and everything else in my environment, but just my ADCs are in this location, and it allows me to continue to be able to effectively manage my platform and my ADC fabric without having to jump around to a bunch of tools. So that's something that I really do like a lot. So that's fantastic. So tell me about I see there's a backup repository. So tell me a little bit about backup repositories and how that would help us manage our ADCs.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Kemp, we consider backup very cheap insurance. Worst case scenario, if the Loadmaster were to have a critical issue, at least you'd have that backup to then restore on a new device and get you up and running again. So backups are very critical. So what Chem360 Central will allow you to do is essentially schedule backups and then upload them into specific devices. So essentially, this will be a repository for backups as well.
So quick question for you. these backups, are they configuration backups or are they system backups? So in other words, would I use this prior to making some rather delicate or complicated changes to an ADC, and if it fails, I can restore it? Or is this like a whole, like, in other words, if I'm going to do a firmware update, would I do this backup and then do a firmware update, and if it doesn't work or goes sideways or I don't like it for some reason, I don't know, whatever, I can roll back? Or is it one and the same, or does it cover both scenarios?
Well, actually, it covers both scenarios. So the backup you're taking is a complete configuration backup from the load master, including interface IPs all the way up to the virtual service configurations. Now, when you restore it, that's when you have the flexibility to do some or all of the configuration. Now, of course, if you do restore the complete configuration, the load master will look to reboot, just because maybe we're setting up bonding and VLANs and other types of interfaces where it would make sense to reboot.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're just restoring virtual services, as in we've made some changes and now we're reverting, that change can happen instantaneously. It doesn't require a reboot at all, and you can basically get back to status quo within a few seconds by restoring that configuration.
Awesome, because I'm guilty of that, right? So I've got a perfectly functioning ADC. I'm going to make some changes to some configuration on an existing virtual service, and all of a sudden it goes sideways, it doesn't work, and I think, okay, well, I'll put it back. And then I go back in there and I put it back the way it was, and it still doesn't work. And I know there's folks on the phone who've been in the same scenario, right? I swear this is the setting it was on. I know it worked before, but having that ability to just push that config back is tremendous. I know that would be a lifesaver. Thank you for showing us that, by the way. The next thing I want to talk about is, I don't know if we've touched upon this enough yet here, is that, as I'd said at the outset, this is not a Kemp-only solution, that this works with third parties. Can you tell us a little bit and maybe show us some of the options and capabilities we have with monitoring third-party platforms? Tell us which ones are supported, which ones may not be supported or supported yet, and I'd love to see that, because I think the ability to manage to provide multi-vendor management is going to be huge. I know I used to work in an environment that had a little bit of everything. Our environment was, primarily an F5, but we also had Kemp and we had some Citrix NetScaler. And today, of course, now that gets even more complicated, because I might have cloud services running in AWS, and I know that they obviously have the Elastic Load Balancer. Azure has a load balancer. Let's talk a little bit about what we can do and what we can't do with regards to third-party ADC management on the 360 Central.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great question. So if we head over to the network view once again in the top left corner, I kind of selected which zones I showed to you guys. I didn't want to reveal everything quite at once. But now that we're bringing up the topic, the Chem360 Central platform has the ability to manage additional ADCs from different vendors, as you mentioned. So if I kind of expand the configuration here, you can also see we've added a few Nginx devices, HA proxies, F5 big IP LTMs, and then, of course, we can also monitor the ELB from AWS and from Azure, the Azure Load Balancer as well. So what Kemp has done is basically giving you more visibility into the other vendors, maybe that they don't even give you, depending on which situation we're talking about. And what we found is we're looking forward to being able to report on these devices and provide management for these devices as well. But sometimes their APIs aren't quite up to snuff. So at this point, we're looking at monitoring these devices, and as their API is mature, we will be then able to work with them and provide changes as well to the configuration.
Fantastic. So F5, HA proxy, Nginx, obviously the Kemp solution. You said it manages the AWS Elastic Load Balancer as well. That's fantastic. As I understand it, the Azure Load Balancer is still not supported yet. I think support is forthcoming for that. And I believe, in speaking with some of the folks inside Kemp who developed the platform, that the Azure Load Balancer actually doesn't have an API, a public API. So I think Microsoft is working on building an API for that, at which point Chem360 would be able to manage the ELB or the load balancer in Azure. So that's fantastic. Also, I noticed that Citrix NetScaler is absent. I assume that NetScaler support will be coming in the future as their APIs either mature or as that's developed. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're always looking to add additional vendors to this device. The more that you have visibility to and the more you can manage with it, the more helpful it is for the different administrators out in the organizations that we're trying to support. So whether it's Kemp, whether it's another device, we'd love to help you out with the visibility portion.
Outstanding. That's going to be great. And again, this is a pretty new product, I guess. So I think it's pretty impressive that it supports all of these platforms, at least out of the box, in a V1 release. I think we're on 1.5 or something like that, but still pretty early on in the life cycle of this product, and it still has pretty broad support. So exciting to see what's what's coming down the pike for additional platforms as well. So I want to switch gears a little bit. So we've been talking about management. Let's talk about that second bullet point that we set out at the outset of this conversation, and that is the visibility component. Can we take a look at how quickly and easily we can assess the performance of our infrastructure? As I'd said, it's not just about up-down. I mean, that's kind of the most crucial thing. But there are also scenarios in which understanding the current load might be tremendously valuable. I know, and I'm a big advocate of not just peak thresholds, but also I don't even know what term to use, but like low-level thresholds or bottom-level thresholds. So one of the things that I've done in some of the solutions that I've managed, and I've managed, by the way, some solutions that supported over 100,000 users when I was in a previous job, and one of the things that that when you were managing these solutions is that you want to make sure that the thresholds, you're not going over thresholds, right? So we don't want to see CPU utilization over this point, bandwidth or throughput exceed this point. But there are some important scenarios, and I'm hoping you can demonstrate this for us, in which I might have low utilization, which would indicate some other problems. Case in point, if I am expecting 60, 70% utilization on the bandwidth, or the throughput, excuse me, and all of a sudden it drops to 0 or 1%, that might be an indication of an upstream problem. Maybe there's a router or a switch that's no longer getting this traffic to my load master. And so it's not going to trigger an alert because it's not over its utilization. It's not exceeded any thresholds at the top level. Can you give us a look at how those things work and how we might address some of those challenges with 360 Central?
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. Now, you made a great point. A lot of people think, issues come with a lot of data, which is true. We do have specific capabilities and capacity-based issues come up once in a while. If the application happens to have more users than we'd planned, something like that. But, as you mentioned, if you, aren't seeing traffic, that could be indicative of a greater problem as well. So Kemp is going to provide a lot of insight to how things are working via the Chem360 Central platform. At a high-level view, you can click on all networks, and this is just going to give you a top-level overview of how everything's working, taking all of the different load masters, all the different sites, all the different other ADCs into consideration, and it gives you your high-level view of that. Now, if you ever wanted to dive into it a little bit greater, just to see how a specific device was doing, or maybe how a specific service is working, you would have the option to do that as well. Now, Kemp will keep historical data for individual devices and show you all this information either as an aggregate or individually. So this will certainly help you baseline what your network utilization looks like for each of these applications. And as you see here, what we're looking at is globally, and then if we want, we can break it down into a per unit view, as it were. I'm going to let the screen catch up to me.
Yeah, this is definitely an area that I see commonly, a real common issue and challenge with organizations is baselining. Often I get called in to do troubleshooting for customers, and the first thing I'll ask is, the problem is, okay, so we see this issue, we have this problem, we have high utilization or whatever the challenge is. So that's fantastic. Well, what does normal look like? Well, let's compare this to your baselines, and usually that's when you hear crickets. Yeah, we don't have baselines, or we know what it is, but we don't have anything, like documented so that we can compare. This is fantastic. I think this is one of the best features of this solution, is to be able to have this essentially almost like a flight recorder, right? So I have this solution where I can look at historical data and say, when people are saying this is slow and this solution is slow, and I can prove that, hey, I have no more utilization than I do on other days, or it's actually just up a small percent, I may be able to, point to other areas or focus my troubleshooting efforts elsewhere. So that looks fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, baselining is very important to understand what the average flow looks like. And of course, if you do see anomalies, that could, raise your alert to whether there's an issue upstream, as you mentioned, or maybe you would be under attack if you saw, a great increase in traffic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fantastic. And of course, multi-vendor. So we look at historical data from all of those platforms that we manage, so I think that's fantastic as well. Now, this is a perfect segue into the last major point that I wanted to talk about, and that was the cloud licensing model. So we talked about cloud elasticity and scalability, right? So we're talking about near limitless capacity. I build a front end for a website, and it goes viral, or my sale is far more compelling than I thought it was going to be, or popular, and so now my front-end websites are just getting hammered. I can spin up in AWS or Azure, it doesn't really matter. I can spin up additional web servers, and I can do that all programmatically. But if I'm using the native load balancers, of course, I'm going to lack some of that, a little bit of that visibility. So I probably want to take advantage of the Kemp platform, but my challenge, of course, is paying for all of that. So if I need to spin up an additional 8 load balancers, with the new metered licensing, we don't have to now license each of those individually. Can you explain a little bit more about metered licensing, how that benefits the customers in the long run, and how that integrates with Chem360 Central?
Absolutely. So meter licensing effectively is a licensing solution that Kemp is now utilizing to help with enterprises that are now expanding. Historically, what we've seen is maybe 1 load masters, 2 load masters in high availability used within a data center to host and support multiple applications. One big box to rule them all kind of mentality. But as time progresses, we see a lot of the organizations maybe are siloed a little bit more and are expanded a little bit more horizontally. So instead of one device for everybody to share, they're looking for multiple devices where each individual IT organization can have their own device, manage it separately, and affectionately be in charge of it. So what Kemp has done is they've basically provided this metered enterprise licensing where enterprises can spin up as many VLMs as they like. And what we're doing is we're just measuring the amount of traffic to each of those devices and then aggregating that in a form of the gigabit per second type of metric. So really, you're just using the devices as much as needed and then reporting on how much the actual usage was. So
in that scenario, real quick, James, in that scenario, then we can deploy additional Chem360s, or excuse me, additional Kemp virtual load masters, spin those up and use them for a period of time and then shut them down, but we didn't have to individually license each VLM that we spun up for that period of time.
Exactly. You'll just use those VLMs as long as you need. If it's a 6-month-long project, if it's for production over the course of a few years, you have the ability to spin them up, spin them down, provision, deprovision as necessary.
Outstanding. And I'm assuming that would apply to migration scenarios. For example, let's say I have implemented a completely new platform. It uses a whole bunch of load masters, but I'm going to retire the other one. I can just simply spin those up, move all of the workloads over. Once I'm happy, I can spin the other environment down. I don't have to worry about purchasing additional licensing, at least at the appliance level.
Yeah, absolutely, and we see that more and more as people move to hybrid designs and even fully placing their infrastructure within a service provider. And what we were trying to do is just make that transition very easy for the end user. So we do that a few different ways. And as you mentioned, having the meter licensing allows you to spin up an additional load master in a different location. transfer your services, and then once you're ready, you can make the full cut over to send production traffic that direction.
Oh, that's tremendous. That's tremendous. So help me understand how Chem360 helps with that. In other words, does it do the actual monitoring of the throughput? Is there a way to gauge how much I'm going to be spending, and is there a way to do some sort of historical reporting on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're looking at the Chem360 Central platform, it can also provide some insight to how your meter licensing units are working, how much they're being utilized, et cetera. Within this central device I have here, I've actually added a few meter licensing devices, and they've had a little bit of load over the last few days here. And essentially what we're going to be able to do is pull reports on a per unit basis, and then the aggregate, of course, to see exactly which units are using, how much throughput, which units are on, which units were provisioned, and just give you an overall idea of what the load masters are doing in your environment. And that's easy enough to find on the actual the Chem360 Central panel here. What we can do is go into our system configuration, and then we have a separate section for meter licensing, which I'll click on right now. So this page is actually going to tell you the units that are active in your environment, just give you a high-level overview, of course, and they'll actually report on which versions of firmware they're running as well, which is very helpful. As you mentioned, you want all those units to be on the same page, so if there is a firmware update, you're running them from the same version to the next version, or if there's a hot fix that's available, you would want to also be able to apply that to all your load masters uniformly as well. Now, since these Mila units were receiving traffic and being utilized throughout the last few days, we can actually pull a usage report, what we call the Mila report here. And in short, it's going to tell you, exactly how your units were doing. And these metrics are going to be quantifiable by throughput and SSL transactions per second. So as I scroll down here, you can see that we had about 9 units online here. 9 instances, of course. And then the max SSL TPS was occurred by device 1 at about the level about 339. And then you can see, of course, the additional data points for the other units as well. And then we continue to give you additional information about the throughput that the device has used. And this is affectionately where you're going to see the different levels of Mila kick in. We have different subscription plans ranging from 1 gigabit per second all the way up to 100. So regardless of the size of the organization, we'll be able to help you out with load balancing, whether that's 1 VLM or 1,000.
Outstanding. Quick question for you. So it's meter. So the licensing, meter licensing works off of throughput, not transaction per second, correct?
Exactly. It is throughput that we're gauging.
Okay.
We also would like to give you the additional information for the SSL TPS. If you were to spin off into a single unit, that is also information that would be very helpful for sizing.
I guess so. Yeah, that does make sense. If you were actually going to go the opposite direction, move to more static licensing, then you would need to know what you would need. Now, let me ask you a question. Let's say we have a scenario in which I have my Chem360 fabric up and running for a period of time, and then I hit a very high peak just in the middle briefly. Maybe it was a really popular sale. Perhaps it was an attack. How does the metered licensing account for perhaps statistical anomalies in my throughputs? In other words, that wasn't actually all legitimate traffic, or maybe it was legitimate traffic, but it was just very brief, maybe for a few hours or even less than a day. How does that work in terms of the licensing? Do I get bumped up to another tier and I have to pay more money, or how does that work?
Well, we do understand that every once in a while you will see some anomalies within the traffic flow, and for this reason, whenever we're talking about annual subscriptions from Mila, what we'll do is we'll actually remove the top 5%, looking at a standard deviation curve. So you guys won't be actually responsible for those weird little ticks in the graph if you were to have a moment of high utilization. Now, if this, of course, is something that's sustained, we would then be able to bill you accordingly based off how much usage there was. But we would be using 95% billing for considering the aggregate throughput.
Very good. Okay, that's good, and that's good to know because you're right. Because I mean, there may be some situations that are beyond my control. Again, the first thing I think of is a DDoS attack, but I might also want to do some load testing, and maybe I just put a ton of traffic at my system. But it's like, well, you don't have to pay for that. I just wanted to do some testing for an hour or two, those types of things. So I think that's definitely tremendously helpful. So, quick question
Yeah,
here, and
absolutely.
this is one that I'm sure is going to be one that needs to be addressed. Is when you start this platform, how are you billed initially, right? So in other words, if I implement all of these, I have no idea what I'm going to use, or maybe I do, but certainly, how is the first month of billing handled? Out of curiosity.
So we'll bill on the back end. Basically what we'll do is we'll allow you to set up the system, utilize it, see the traffic that's coming through the device, and then what we'll do is we'll look at the totals at the end of the month. So if you guys are seeing a spike in traffic, you'll have all that information prior to billing, to which then we can appropriately put you in the correct tier for the subscriptions. And that would range
no
from
surprises.
gigabit to 100. Yep, absolutely.
Fantastic. No surprises. Love that. I love that. That's wonderful. Great. Now, the metered licensing again seems pretty powerful. This works across clouds, right? So I could have VLMs on premises. I could have them in Azure and AWS. It doesn't really matter, right? You don't care about the number of appliances or even where they reside, correct?
Yeah, all we're really looking for is network connectivity. The Chem360 Central device utilizes the LoadMaster ADC's API to pull information, make changes. So as long as we have the point-to-point connectivity, that's really all that's required. Of course, syslogging is another port that you may look to open and make sure it works between the devices. But all in all, we really don't have any barriers to entry when placing this in various networks.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. Great. Outstanding. Okay, well, I think that kind of wraps up. I mean, we covered off on all of our, at least the top three. We addressed the top three challenges, I think. There are certainly many, many more. You can see, folks on the call, that the Chem 360 is an extremely powerful platform, and one in which I think that you'll find some immediate value in your organization. I want to open it up to questions now, and James, I'll forward these to you. I see, I'm going to open up the menu here, take a look at these. Some of these have been answered, but I want to answer them again just for the benefit of the entire audience. So the question here is, does the Chem 360 Central support Citrix NetScaler and A10? So today the answer is no. Those are certainly in the queue, I'm sure. Again, the folks at Kemp are looking to add as many platforms as they possibly can to this, because that's really the benefit of this solution. This is, again, not a Kemp strictly solution. Of course, the best experiences with the Kemp, I mean, obviously, it has the deepest integration with with native the Kemp native ADC, the LoadMaster, but it does have a tremendous amount of integration capabilities with others. So look for things like A10, Citrix, loadbalancer.org, some of these other ones that are out there. Look for those in the future. I'm sure those will be coming at some point in the future. Next question: is throughput limited to the virtual server, or is it all traffic through the load balancer? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a great question. Some of the features within the LoadMaster allow you to provide a transparent connection, as we call it, to the server, so you can see the client's IP. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times that does require making the server's gateway, that is, the LoadMaster. So with that routing change, you may have some traffic going through the load balancer as a gateway, and at that point, we're not actually counting that towards the metered licensing. The metered licensing is really just measuring the virtual service-based traffic. So if you are using the LoadMaster as a gateway for your servers, not a problem.
That is fantastic. That's great to know. that is good. And that was a question that I was thinking as well while we were going through that. I thought, man, there are some scenarios in which we do, due to some routing issues, we do have to make the load balancer the default gateway. So yeah, how does that work? So basically just inbound traffic on the VS. We don't care if anything's returning. So that's very good. Great. Outstanding then. Looking through these other questions here, we touched off on most of these in the session. Do the backups include certificates? And that's an excellent question. So there's obviously certificates and private keys. When we do the backup, I'm assuming it takes all of that, correct? So when we do a restore, all the certificates, all the private keys go back?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, because the certificates and private keys are located in the same file, so to speak, we'll make sure that that file is password protected.
Outstanding, and that's good. So with regards to our backups, and when you were talking about centralized backups, those are well protected on the Chem360 as well, correct?
Yep, I don't believe you have any way to actually get those out of the device except for through the central device management itself.
Perfect. Some questions with regards to security. Does the Chem360 support role-based access? And that's a great one because you may want to have somebody, be able to monitor, but you don't want them to actually make changes to virtual services or update, firmware. Does it support role-based access?
Absolutely. Now, with Chem360 Central in mind, we know there was a wide variety of end users, from IT administrators to service providers. So what we've done is we've created different hierarchies and allow you to group users together. So essentially, you can get very granular access for individual nodes or the entire configuration. So, for example, if you wanted to give your boss read-only access to the entire environment, because you didn't want to mess anything up, you could do that. And if you were a service provider, you could give your end users insight to the individual networks or individual load masters and just limit their view to that piece.
Great. That's excellent. Very good. Okay. Next question. Can the 360 Central be used to migrate workloads? And so I'm assuming that this is a scenario in which we want to let's say we have an application that's on premises and we're going to shift that to the cloud. So basically I want to get my entire configuration from on-premises to the cloud, and that includes the load masters. Is there a way to, for example, move specific pieces of the configuration, maybe not the entire configuration, but like a virtual service? Let's say, for example, a virtual service is running on a load master on premises, and I'm now moving this one application to the cloud. Can I move that virtual service to the cloud using 360 Central?
And the answer is absolutely. Chem360 Central has a very unique feature that we call VS Motion, where essentially you can copy or completely move a specific virtual service from one load master to a completely different load master. And as we saw in the Chem360 Central management platform, you can be talking about a load master halfway across the world. Now that would work, obviously from going on-prem to in the cloud, but we've also seen use cases where internally you may be testing this in development, in QA, in staging, and then move it to production. And you can use that same VS Motion to move them from different load masters in each organization unit.
Outstanding, great. Next question. Does the load master, or excuse me, does the Chem360 Central support web application firewall rules and ESP? I'm gonna guess that's not necessarily in the 360 Central, but that's more a part of the VLM, and it's managed through 360 Central. Is that correct?
Exactly. So the Edge Security Pack allows the load master to provide authentication at the point of the ADC. We also can string this together with multiple services to create a single sign-on effect. And that feature set, along with the web application firewall, are available at the ADC level. And of course, using Chem360 Central, you can create services, enable ESP, enable the WAF, however you'd like, all from that single pane of glass.
So fantastic. So we can do all of that through the 360 Central. We don't actually have to go out and individually manage these appliances anymore, then it sounds like. But can you? What if I choose to? So in other words, once I configure the 360 Central, does that mean I cannot configure the appliances locally?
Oh, no, by all means. I mean, There's even a way within the Chem360 Central platform to open up a browser tab to actually go to that unit directly. So just because you use Chem360 Central doesn't mean that's the only way to admin the devices. You still have the traditional way of going directly to the web user interface as well.
Oh, that's tremendous. That's excellent. Okay, good, good. Yeah, so that's fantastic. I know that there's been some solutions I've worked in the past that basically it's one or the other, and as soon as it's monitored centrally, then you can't actually go locally, and then you can have, and I've in some use corner cases where you can't get into either, and then you're really hosed. So that's wonderful. That's tremendous. Okay, great. And then the connectivity, I'm assuming then is just standard management APIs, right? So it's everything done over SSL and TLS, I'd expect.
Yeah, nothing crazy there.
Outstanding. And you said syslog, so obviously we have, if I'm thinking, and I'm wearing my network security hat, by the way, now, if you can't tell, if we have firewalls between the load masters, they would need to be configured to allow SSL TLS, so TCP port, well, not 443, but whatever the management port is, and I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head what that is for the Kemp. It's the same port that you use for the web browser, right, when you manage the appliances individually, correct?
Yeah, exactly, and that may vary. You know, if we're talking on premises, typically you'll be using 443, but if it's in the cloud, we may be using the abstracted port like 8443.
Makes sense. Okay, so that port needs to be open, and then syslog. So those two ports, and then you're good to go. No other ports need to be open for management or maintenance or anything.
No, pretty straightforward configuration. And of course, we have this all documented on our website. So if anybody wants to take the time to head to the Kemp Technologies website, under our resource library or documentation page, you'll find plenty of information about Chem360 Central and actually a link to install it yourself.
Outstanding. That's fantastic. Okay, great. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to kind of get to this closing slide and let everybody know that we have a survey that we'd like for you guys to participate in. It would be tremendously beneficial and helpful for us. So if you could do that as well, that would be fantastic. Any other questions? Go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. If we haven't had a chance to get to all of them, we'll try to do that after the session and get back with you, or somebody from Kemp will get back with you. But thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. Andrew, did you have any closing comments, or did you have any other comments that you wanted to make as well?
No, I'd just like to say thank you, Richard and James, for the great insights today. And as you mentioned, Richard, yeah, there's just a survey at the end of the webinar that we'd like you to fill out, and also just to check out the resources that are there, the Mila solution brief, and also it's worth checking out, as we mentioned earlier, that ASOS customer success story. So yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, Richard and James for presenting, and any questions that we didn't get to now, we will get to after the webinar. And also I'll be sending out the on-demand recording as well, so you can have a look over this presentation again. So once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'd hope to see you on one of our future webinars. Thank you, and goodbye.